Blood soaked through the pages of my journal, each crimson drop spreading like watercolor paint across words I'd written just hours before. Sometimes I dream of pushing him down the stairs. The irony wasn't lost on me as I pressed my torn blouse against the cut above my eye Mark's class ring, having left its mark when his fist connected with my face. Outside my bedroom window, November wind rattled the farmhouse shutters with the same violence that had just erupted in our kitchen downstairs. My name is Elena Rose Morrison, and at 15, I carried 2 secrets that could destroy everything I was pregnant with my brother's child, and I had just discovered exactly how far desperation could push a person toward the unthinkable. The journal beneath my trembling hands contained 3 years of careful documentation, not the silly musings of a teenage girl, but evidence of a nightmare that had been building since I turned 12. I touched my swollen lip, where Father's wedding ring had split the skin, tasting copper and salt, as I remembered his words. "Whose bastard are you carrying?" The pregnancy test I'd hidden in my dresser drawer had been discovered during one of his drunken searches through my belongings looking for money I might have stolen or contraband I might have hidden. When I couldn't answer his question, when the truth lodged in my throat like broken glass, his rage had exploded across our kitchen like a bomb detonating. Now, sitting alone in my room while the house settled into its familiar pattern of tense silence, I whispered the words I couldn't speak aloud. "It's Mark's baby. My own brother forced this on me." The admission hung in the air like smoke, finally given voice, but not yet believed, not even by me. Our farmhouse squatted on the endless Iowa plains, like a wounded animal 40 miles from the nearest town, with more than a gas station and a church. Built by my grandfather in 1919, the 2-story structure had weathered nearly 50 years of harsh winters and scorching summers. Its white paint now gray and blistered the wraparound porch, sagging under the weight of time and neglect. Inside the walls seemed to absorb sound and sorrow alike, holding our family's secrets in the spaces between rotting wooden beams. Father James Morrison was 46 years old and built like the farm equipment he repaired to supplement our meager income. His hands permanently stained with motor oil and scarred from decades of wrestling with stubborn machinery could coax life from the most damaged engine. Those same hands had learned to communicate through violence when words proved insufficient, which happened more frequently as the whiskey bottles multiplied in his workshop. He'd grown up during the worst years of the Depression, raised by a father who believed children existed to work and women existed to serve. That philosophy had been passed down like a family curse, each generation adding their own particular brand of cruelty to the legacy. Mother Catherine Morrison had once possessed a beauty that stopped conversations in the grocery store. I could see evidence of it in the wedding photograph on our mantel, where her smile seemed to light up the entire frame, and her auburn hair caught sunlight like spun copper. Now, at 41, she moved through our house like a sleepwalker, navigating a familiar nightmare, her once bright green eyes perpetually focused on the floor or some distant point beyond the horizon. Years of walking on eggshells had worn her down to sinew and bone, her voice rarely rising above a whisper, except when she hummed old hymns while doing dishes, the same 3 songs on endless repeat, as if the melodies could somehow sanctify the suffering that saturated our daily existence. My brother Mark was 21 years old, and everything I was not. Where I was small and dark-haired like father, he was tall and golden like the corn that surrounded our farm each summer. The former high school football captain turned construction worker, he possessed an easy charm that made church ladies ruffle his hair and young women giggle behind their hands when he smiled in their direction. He worked road crew during the day and spent most evenings at Patterson's Tavern in town, holding court with stories that grew more impressive with each telling. To everyone else, Mark Morrison was the kind of all-American boy you'd want your daughter to bring home for Sunday dinner. To me, he was the predator who'd been stalking me through the hallways of our own house for the past 3 years. I had started keeping my journal when I was 11, initially filling it with typical childhood observations about school and friends and the endless boredom of farm life. But somewhere around my 12th birthday, the entries had taken on a darker tone as Mark's behavior toward me began shifting from normal sibling teasing into something that made my skin crawl. At first, I'd convinced myself it was my imagination. Big brothers were supposed to be protective, weren't they? Sometimes that protection looked possessive, invasive, inappropriate. But when protection became violation and violation became routine, I started documenting everything with the obsessive detail of someone building a case. Mark came into my room again last night while Mother and Father were asleep. I'd written 6 months ago. He said he was checking to make sure I was okay, but his hands weren't checking for anything a brother should be looking for. When I told him to leave, he said I was being dramatic and that he'd tell Father I was lying if I complained. The entries had grown progressively more explicit as Mark's behavior escalated from inappropriate touching to outright assault. By the time I turned 15, our house had become a battlefield where I fought a losing war against an enemy who held all the power. The November evening when everything changed started like any other. Father had returned from Hendrick's farm with grease under his fingernails and a check that wouldn't cover half our monthly expenses. Mother served dinner in the oppressive silence that had become our family's primary language: meatloaf that tasted like sawdust green beans from our failing garden, and mashed potatoes that had been stretched with too much milk and too little butter. Mark dominated the conversation as he always did, regaling us with stories from his construction job. He talked about the new shopping center going up near Des Moines, about how the foreman had praised his work ethic, about the Mustang he was planning to buy once he'd saved enough money. Father grunted approval between bites, occasionally asking questions about wages or working conditions. Mother smiled her brittle practice smile and murmured appropriate responses at appropriate intervals. I pushed food around my plate and wondered if they could see it, the secret growing inside me like a tumor made of shame and terror. 6 weeks had passed since I'd missed my first period. 6 weeks of morning sickness that I'd blamed on stomach flu, of loose clothing carefully selected to hide what couldn't be hidden much longer. I'd stolen the pregnancy test from Morrison's pharmacy during lunch break from school, my heart hammering so violently I was certain Mrs. Morrison could hear it from behind the prescription counter. 2 pink lines. Positive. The word had stared back at me from the drugstore bathroom like an accusation written in blood. After dinner, while Mother washed dishes with the mechanical precision of someone performing a religious ritual, I retreated to my room and tried to lose myself in sketching. Art had always been my sanctuary, detailed drawings of places I'd never been, faces I'd never met, lives I'd never have the chance to live. Tonight, I drew a train station at dawn with a young woman standing on the platform, holding a suitcase. Her face turned toward distant mountains, barely visible through morning mist. I'd never seen mountains in person, but I imagined they must feel like freedom looked vast and unchangeable, and utterly indifferent to the small tragedies of individual lives. The familiar creak of floorboards outside my door interrupted my concentration, and I knew, without looking up, that Mark was there. He had a particular way of moving through the house after dark, like he owned every shadow and silence. When he knocked that soft, deceptive rap that always preceded violation, I didn't answer. When he entered anyway, I kept drawing my pencil, scratching across paper, like a prayer to gods who didn't seem to be listening. "Hey there, little sister," he said, his voice honey-sweet with false affection. "Working on something special." He settled onto my bed without invitation, the mattress sagging under his weight. His presence filled the small room like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. I could smell the beer on his breath mixing with aftershave and something else, something predatory that made my stomach lurch. "Just drawing?" I mumbled, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "You're getting really talented," he said, leaning closer to examine my sketch. His hand brushed against mine deliberately, and I jerked away as if I'd been burned. "Maybe someday you'll draw something for me. Something personal." The word personal hung between us like a blade loaded with implications that made my skin crawl. Mark's definition of personal had evolved over the past 3 years, growing darker and more invasive with each encounter. What had started as inappropriate comments had escalated to unwanted touching, then to violations that left me feeling hollowed out and contaminated. "I need to finish my homework," I said, closing the sketchbook and clutching it against my chest like armor. Mark's smile faltered, revealing something hungry and dangerous underneath. "It's Friday night, Elena. Nobody does homework on Friday night." He reached for me, then his hand settling on my shoulder, with the casual possessiveness of someone who'd never been told no. I stood up quickly, moving toward the door, but he was faster. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, not hard enough to leave visible bruises, but firm enough to remind me exactly who was stronger. "Don't be like that," he whispered, pulling me back toward the bed. "You know how much I care about you, how much I protect you from Father's temper from the gossip at school. You owe me something for that protection." "No," I said, the syllable falling from my lips like a stone into still water. "Not tonight." Something shifted in Mark's expression. Surprise first, then irritation, then something much darker. He'd grown accustomed to my compliance over the years, to the way I'd learned to disappear inside my own head while he took what he wanted. My resistance was a foreign language he didn't recognize or appreciate. "What did you say to me?" His grip on my wrist tightened until I could feel my pulse beating against his thumb. "I said no." My voice was stronger this time, fed by a desperation I'd never experienced before. "I can't. We can't keep doing this." Mark laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think you get to decide after everything I've done for you? All the times I could have told Father about your little journal, about those crazy ideas you write about running away." The threat hit me like a physical blow. Mark had discovered my journal months ago, had read my most private thoughts, and used them as leverage to ensure my continued silence. He knew exactly how to keep me trapped, not just through physical force, but through the promise that any attempt to expose him would result in my own destruction. "This is different," I said, my hand moving instinctively to my stomach. "Everything's different now." Mark's eyes followed the gesture, and understanding dawned across his features, like sunrise breaking over a wasteland. His face went pale, then flushed red with something that might have been panic or rage or both. "You're not," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, tears finally breaking free. 6 weeks. For a moment, Mark looked like a boy again, scared and small, and completely lost. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was the predator once more, calculating and cold. "Get rid of it," he said flatly. "I can't." "You will." He stood up, towering over me in the cramped room. "Or I'll tell Father exactly whose baby it is. I'll tell him how you seduced me, how you begged for it, how you've been throwing yourself at me for years. Who do you think he'll believe?" The question pierced through me like a blade because I already knew the answer. Father would believe Mark, Golden Boy Mark, who could do no wrong in his eyes. Father would believe that his damaged, difficult daughter had corrupted his perfect son, and his rage would be biblical in its intensity. "You have until Monday to figure it out," Mark said, moving toward the door. "After that, I start talking." He left me alone with his ultimatum hanging in the air like poison gas. I sank onto my bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror across the room, a 15-year-old girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's brittle smile, carrying her brother's child and drowning in secrets that threatened to pull her under completely. Outside, the November wind continued its mournful song, rattling windows and doors like a ghost trying to get inside. In a few hours, the sun would rise on another day in the Morrison house, and we would all pretend that everything was normal. But normal was a luxury we'd never been able to afford, and now it was slipping away entirely. I opened my journal to a fresh page and began to write not about escape this time, but about ending. About the various ways a 15-year-old girl might disappear from a world that had never wanted her in the first place. The words flowed like blood from a wound, dark and thick, and surprisingly easy once I'd started. But even as I wrote about death, part of me was still planning for life. Part of me was still that girl drawing mountain ranges and train stations, still believing that somewhere beyond the endless Iowa plains, there had to be a place where secrets couldn't suffocate you, and family didn't mean fear. I just had to find the courage to reach for it. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, with frost painting intricate patterns on my bedroom window that looked like the lace on Mother's wedding dress, delicate and beautiful, and destined to melt away the moment sunlight touched them. I woke to the familiar sounds of Father's morning routine, drifting up from the kitchen coffee, percolating radio weather report, the scrape of his chair against linoleum as he settled in to read yesterday's paper. Mother was already at the stove when I came downstairs, her movements quick and nervous as she scrambled eggs and fried bacon. She'd covered the bruise on her left temple with powder, but I could still see the yellow-green shadow underneath where Father's knuckles had connected during one of his recent outbursts. We were a family of walking wounded, each carrying our own collection of visible and invisible scars. Mark sat at the kitchen table reading the sports section, his golden hair catching weak morning light streaming through the curtained window. He looked up when I entered, and for just a moment I caught something in his expression that might have been uncertainty or even fear. But it vanished so quickly, I might have imagined it. "Morning, sleepyhead?" he said, his voice carrying exactly the right note of brotherly affection for Father's benefit. "You look tired. Everything okay?" The question was loaded with subtext that only I could decode. I poured myself a glass of orange juice with hands that trembled only slightly and took my usual seat across from him. "Fine," I said. "Just couldn't sleep well." Father looked up from his paper bloodshot eyes, taking in my appearance with the calculating gaze of someone who missed nothing important when he wasn't completely drunk. "You getting sick?" he asked. "Can't afford to have you missing school." "No, sir. Just bad dreams." Mother set a plate of eggs in front of me, her fingers brushing against my shoulder, in what might have been comfort or warning. The touch was so brief I might have imagined it, but it left me with the strange sensation that she knew more than she was letting on. "Eat," she murmured. "You're getting too thin." The irony of her observation wasn't lost on me. Soon I wouldn't be thin at all. Soon my body would betray the secret I was carrying, and there would be no hiding what Mark had done to me. The thought made the eggs taste like sawdust in my mouth. Mark finished his breakfast and stood up stretching like a cat in afternoon sunshine. "I'm heading into town," he announced. "Johnson wants me to look at some equipment he's thinking of buying for the crew." Father nodded approval. "Good. Learn the business side. That's where the real money is." After Mark left, the kitchen fell into its usual morning quiet. Father retreated to his workshop to tinker with whatever piece of broken machinery currently held his attention, and Mother began the endless cycle of cleaning that occupied most of her waking hours. I sat at the table, pushing cold eggs around my plate, and trying to imagine a future that didn't involve living in this house forever. The silence stretched between Mother and me like a bridge neither of us dared cross. Finally, she spoke without looking up from the sink where she was washing dishes with unnecessary vigor. "You've been different lately," she said quietly. "Scared? More scared than usual." The observation caught me off guard. I'd spent years assuming that Mother saw nothing, noticed nothing, understood nothing about the undercurrents of violence and fear that shaped our daily lives. But maybe silence wasn't the same thing as blindness. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "No." She turned around, then really looking at me for the first time in months. "You're not fine. Neither am I. Neither is this family." We stared at each other across the small kitchen, and for a moment, I glimpsed the woman she might have been under different circumstances, someone with opinions and boundaries and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. Mother, I began, then stopped. How do you tell someone that their son is a monster? How do you explain that the golden boy they've spent 21 years loving and protecting has been destroying their daughter piece by piece? I know, she said softly, and my heart stopped. I've known for a while. Been known what? She moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. About Mark, about what he's been doing to you. The admission hung between us like smoke from a gun barrel. I felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting underneath my feet. Why didn't you? I started, then couldn't finish the question. Because I'm a coward, she said simply. Because I was afraid of what your father would do if he found out. Afraid of what would happen to this family, to our reputation, to everything we've built here. What we've built! The words exploded out of me with more force than I'd intended. What have we built, Mother? A house full of secrets and violence and fear. A family where the strong prey on the weak and everyone pretends not to notice. Tears were streaming down her face, now cutting tracks through the powder she'd used to hide her bruises. I tried to protect you, she whispered. I tried to keep you away from him as much as possible, to make sure you were never alone with him. But you couldn't protect me, I said, and the words came out crueler than I'd intended. You couldn't protect me any more than you could protect yourself. She flinched, as if I'd struck her, and immediately I felt ashamed. Mother wasn't the enemy here, she was. Another victim trapped in the same web of fear and silence that had ensnared me. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I didn't mean, yes you did. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing powder and revealing more of the bruising underneath. And you're right. I failed you. I failed as a mother, as a woman, as a human being. We stood there in the kitchen that had witnessed so many of our family's small tragedies, surrounded by the detritus of a normal morning that felt anything but normal. Finally, Mother spoke again. Is there more? She asked. Something else you need to tell me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who was drowning just as surely as I was. Someone who might understand the weight of carrying secrets that could destroy everything you'd ever known. I'm pregnant, I said. The words fell between us like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward until they touched every corner of our small world. Mother's face went white, then gray, then something beyond pale that suggested she might actually faint. How long? She whispered. 6 weeks. And the father? I didn't need to answer. She already knew. Had known, she said for a while. Dear God, she breathed, sinking into the chair across from me. Dear God in heaven, what are we going to do? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I realized that for the first time in my life, Mother was looking to me for answers instead of pretending she had them herself. I don't know, I admitted. Mark says I have to get rid of it, or he'll tell Father it was my fault, that I seduced him. Mother made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. And your father would believe him? Yes, because I raised a son who's a monster and married a man who's a fool. She buried her face in her hands. Because I've spent 20 years building a life on lies and silence, and the hope that if I just kept my head down long enough, everything would somehow work out. What do we do? I asked. She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not hope exactly, but determination. The look of someone who'd finally reached the bottom and decided to start climbing. We make a plan, she said. A real plan. Not more silence, not more hiding, but an actual plan to get you out of this. For the next hour, we talked in whispers about possibilities and logistics and the various ways a 15-year-old girl might disappear from rural Iowa without a trace. Mother revealed that she'd been hiding money for years, small amounts skimmed from grocery shopping, from the household account, from Father's drinking money when he was too drunk to remember how much he'd had. It's not much, she said, showing me a coffee can hidden behind bags of flour in the pantry. Maybe $300, but it's enough to get you started somewhere else. Come with me, I said impulsively. We'll both leave, start over somewhere he can't find us. She smiled then, and for a moment, she looked like the young woman in the wedding photograph, beautiful and hopeful and unbroken. I can't, she said. I'm too old, too scared, too damaged. But you're young enough to build something new, strong enough to survive whatever comes next. I don't feel strong. Neither did I when I was your age. But strength isn't something you feel, it's something you do. And you've been doing it for years, even when you didn't realize it. We spent the rest of the morning making lists and contingency plans, talking in hushed tones about bus schedules and cities large enough to disappear into. It felt surreal, like we were planning a vacation instead of my escape from everything I'd ever known. But underneath the practical details, something else was happening. For the first time in my life, Mother and I were having a real conversation, not the careful dance of pleasantries and avoidance that had characterized our relationship for years, but an honest discussion between two women who'd finally acknowledged the truth about their circumstances. I should have left him years ago, she said as we counted the money in the coffee can for the third time. Should have taken you and Mark and run the first time he raised his hand to me. Why didn't you? Because I believed the lies, she said simply. The ones he told me and the ones I told myself. That it was my fault somehow. That I deserved it. That love was supposed to hurt, and if it didn't hurt, it wasn't real. Do you still love him? She was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the bare fields that stretched toward the horizon. I love the man I thought he was when I married him, she said finally. But that man never really existed. What I fell in love with was a performance, a mask he wore until he was sure I couldn't leave. And Mark is what happens when a boy grows up watching his father hurt his mother, and nobody ever tells him it's wrong. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. I love my son, but I don't like who he's become. And I know that if you stay here, he'll destroy you completely. The honesty of her admission was both devastating and liberating. For years, I'd felt guilty about my hatred for Mark, as if my inability to love my own brother made me fundamentally defective. But hearing Mother acknowledge the same truth somehow made it okay to feel what I'd been feeling all along. What will happen when Father finds out I'm gone? I asked. He'll be angry, she said. Probably the angriest I've ever seen him. But his anger will be directed at me, not you. And I can handle his anger better than you can handle Mark's attention. I don't want to leave you alone with them. You're not leaving me alone, she said firmly. You're giving me a purpose. For the first time in 20 years, I'll be protecting someone, instead of just surviving from one day to the next. That afternoon, while Father worked in his shop and Mark was still in town, Mother and I finalized our plan. I would leave Sunday night after everyone was asleep. She would drive me to the bus station in Cedar Rapids, where I could catch a Greyhound to Chicago. The city was large enough to disappear into, but close enough that the bus fare wouldn't consume all our money. What will you tell them when they ask where I am? I asked. The truth, she said, that you ran away in the night and I don't know where you went. They'll search for a while, but eventually they'll give up. People disappear from small towns all the time. And if they don't give up, then I'll deal with that when it happens. But Elena, you can't live your life based on what might go wrong. You have to take the chance when it's offered to you. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, pretending everything was normal, I studied the faces of my family with new eyes. Father, already halfway through his nightly bottle of whiskey, complained about government regulations and the price of feed corn. Mark, freshly showered and wearing his best shirt for another night at the tavern, dominated the conversation with stories about his day in town. And Mother, moving through her evening routine with the same quiet efficiency she'd displayed for 20 years, but with something different in her posture, a straightness to her spine that suggested she'd finally remembered how to stand up for something. You're quiet tonight, Mark observed, looking directly at me across the table. Everything okay, little sister? The endearment that had once made me cringe now sounded almost pathetic, the desperate attempt of a predator to maintain his disguise even when his prey had already seen through it. Just thinking, I said. About what? At the future? He smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes. The future's a funny thing, he said. Sometimes it turns out exactly like you planned it. Sometimes it surprises you. The comment felt like a threat wrapped in philosophy, a reminder that he still held power over my immediate circumstances, even if that power was about to expire. I smiled back and said nothing, but inside, I was counting down the hours until Sunday night. After dinner, I retreated to my room and began the delicate process of deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The practical items were easy clothes, toiletries, the small amount of jewelry Mother had given me over the years. But the personal items were harder to choose. My journal was definitely coming with me along with my best art supplies and a few finished drawings that meant something special. But I also wanted to take letters from a pen pal I'd had in 7th grade, the music box Father had given me for my 10th birthday during one of his rare periods of sobriety. In the end, I realized I was trying to pack my entire life into a single suitcase, which was impossible. Some things would have to be left behind not because they weren't important, but because the future I was moving toward had to be light enough to carry. I was folding clothes by lamplight when Mark appeared in my doorway without knocking. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, watching me with the lazy interest of a cat observing a mouse. "Packing?" he asked. My heart stopped, but I kept my voice level. "Organizing. My closet's a mess." He stepped into the room uninvited, moving closer to examine what I was doing. "Looks like you're getting ready for a trip." "Just putting away summer clothes," I lied. "It's November." He picked up one of my sweaters, holding it up to the light as if examining it for flaws. "This is your favorite," he said. "The one you wore to homecoming last year." "It's just a sweater." "Nothing's just anything with you, Elena. You attach meaning to everything, clothes, drawings, songs on the radio. You're sentimental that way." He dropped the sweater and moved closer, backing me against my dresser. I could smell aftershave and beer and something else, something that reminded me of hunting season and fresh blood. "So if you were packing this sweater," he continued, "it would mean you were planning to go somewhere you'd want to look nice. Somewhere important." "I'm not going anywhere." "Good." His hand touched my cheek, a gesture that might have looked affectionate to an observer, but felt like ownership to me. "Because we haven't finished our conversation from last night, about your little problem." "It's not a problem," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "It's a baby." His expression darkened. "It's a mistake. One that needs to be corrected before it ruins both our lives." "Your life doesn't have to be ruined," I said. "You could just stop. Leave me alone. Let me figure out what to do without threatening me." Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think it's that simple? You think I can just walk away from everything we've built together?" "We haven't built anything together. You've been taking what you wanted, and I've been too scared to stop you." "That's not how I remember it." "Then you remember wrong." His hand moved from my cheek to my throat, not squeezing, but resting there like a promise of what could happen if I continued to defy him. "Here's what's going to happen," he said quietly. "You're going to take care of this problem, quietly, discreetly, without involving anyone else. And then we're going to go back to the way things were." "No." The word came out stronger than I'd expected, and Mark's grip on my throat tightened slightly. "No, I'm not getting rid of it. And I'm not going back to the way things were. I'm done, Mark. I'm done being afraid of you." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes that might have been respect or might have been rage. Then his mask slipped back into place, and he was the predator again. "You think you're done?" he asked. "You think you get to make that choice?" "Yes." "Then you're stupider than I thought." He released my throat and stepped back, but his posture remained threatening. You have until Monday morning to change your mind. After that, I start talking to people. Father first, then maybe some folks in town? You know how gossip spreads in a place like this. What will you tell them? The truth, he said with a smile that made my blood freeze. That my little sister has been throwing herself at me for years. That I tried to be a good brother and push her away. But she kept coming back for more. That when she got pregnant, she tried to blame me for her own slutty behavior. The scenario he painted was so twisted, so perfectly calculated to destroy me while protecting him, that I almost admired its vicious creativity. He'd spent years studying our family dynamics, understanding exactly which buttons to push and which lies would be most believable. No one will believe you, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Everyone will believe me, he corrected. Because I'm the good son, the one who never caused problems or talked back or made trouble. And you're the weird one, the one who draws strange pictures and keeps to herself and has always been a little too intense for her own good. He moved toward the door, then paused to deliver his final blow. Monday morning, Elena. Think carefully about what you want your life to look like after that. After he left, I sank onto my bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror across the room. The girl looking back at me seemed younger than 15, with wide, dark eyes and skin so pale it was almost translucent. She looked fragile, breakable, like someone who'd never survived a single difficult day in her life. But appearances could be deceiving. That fragile-looking girl had survived 3 years of systematic abuse and was now planning her own escape. She'd documented her trauma with the methodical precision of a detective building a case. She'd formed an alliance with the one person in the house who might be able to protect her, even if that protection came too late to prevent the damage. She was stronger than she looked. Stronger than anyone realized, including herself. Sunday night arrived gray and moonless, with clouds hanging low over the farmhouse like a burial shroud. I lay in bed, fully clothed, listening to the familiar sounds of my family settling into sleep. Father's snores from down the hall, Mother's restless movements as she tried to find a comfortable position, Mark's radio playing softly in his room, until finally clicking off around midnight. At 2 a.m, I slipped out of bed and gathered the suitcase I'd hidden under my desk. Everything I needed for my new life was packed inside clothes, toiletries, art supplies, the $300 Mother had saved, and my journal containing 3 years of evidence that would never see the inside of a courtroom. I crept down the stairs, avoiding the step that creaked and the floorboard that groaned under pressure. Mother was waiting for me in the kitchen, fully dressed and holding her car keys. "Ready," she whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. We slipped out the back door and crossed the yard to where Mother's old Plymouth was parked behind the barn, far enough from the house that the engine noise wouldn't wake anyone. The night air was sharp and cold, cutting through my jacket and making me shiver. "You don't have to do this," I said as Mother started the engine. "There's still time to change your mind." "There's no changing my mind," she said firmly. "This is the first right thing I've done in 20 years. I'm not backing out now." The drive to Cedar Rapids took 45 minutes, most of it on dark country roads, where our headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the surrounding blackness. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say. Instead, I stared out the window at farmhouses where other families were sleeping peacefully, where children felt safe in their own beds, and mothers didn't have to choose between their children's survival. The bus station was nearly empty at 3 a.m, just a few travelers waiting for early connections, and a clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Mother bought my ticket to Chicago and walked me to the gate, where we stood in awkward silence while we waited for boarding to begin. "Write to me," she said finally. "Not at the house they'll intercept the mail, but there's a post office box in town under my maiden name. Catherine Mills, Box 47. How will I get the number? I'll send it to General Delivery in Chicago. Check every few weeks until it comes through." The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, and suddenly our time was up. I turned to face Mother, trying to memorize her face in case I never saw it again. "Thank you," I said, "for everything, for saving me." "You saved yourself," she replied. "I just helped with the logistics." She hugged me, then really hugged me, not the careful, distant embraces she usually offered. For a moment, I felt like I was being held by the mother I'd always needed, the one who'd been buried under years of fear and compromise. "Be happy," she whispered in my ear. "Be free. Be everything we never allowed you to be." I climbed onto the bus and found a seat near the back, pressing my face to the window as we pulled away from the station. Mother stood on the platform waving until we turned the corner, and she disappeared from view. As the bus carried me through the darkness toward Chicago, I pressed my hand to my belly and whispered to the life growing inside me, "We're going to be okay. We're going to be free." I had no idea that freedom would be the hardest thing I'd ever fought for, or that the truth about that night would be far more complicated than I could imagine. But for the first time in my life, I was moving towards something instead of running away from it, and that felt like hope, even if hope was something I'd forgotten how to recognize. Chicago in December was an assault on every sense I possessed. After a lifetime of prairie silence broken only by wind and the occasional lowing of cattle, the city felt like being dropped into the middle of a mechanical thunderstorm, car horns blaring, elevated trains rattling overhead, and the constant hum of 10,000 conversations happening simultaneously. I found a room at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house in Uptown, a narrow 3-story building wedged between a delicatessen that smelled of garlic and desperation and a barbershop where old men gathered to argue about baseball and politics. The landlady was a Polish immigrant with suspicious eyes and hands stained permanently brown from doing other people's laundry. See. "No men after 10 o'clock, she announced in heavily accented English as she led me up 3 flights of stairs to a room barely larger than my closet back home. "No noise, no trouble, first month in advance." I paid her with bills from Mother's coffee can and tried not to wince at how quickly my nest egg was shrinking. The room contained a narrow bed with sheets that had been washed so many times they felt like sandpaper, a dresser with drawers that stuck, and a single window that looked out onto an alley where garbage cans overflowed and stray cats fought over scraps. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had a space that belonged to me alone, where no one could enter without permission, where I could lock the door and know I was safe. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse. Finding work proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. My small-town appearance and obvious inexperience marked me as an outsider, and most employers took one look at my growing belly and turned me away without explanation. I lied about my age, claiming to be 18, but I looked even younger than 15, and desperation had a scent that people could detect from across a room. Finally, I found a position at Rosie's Diner, a 24-hour establishment near the bus station that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and hamburgers that had been frozen thawed and frozen again more times than anyone cared to count. The owner, Rose Kowalski, no relation to my landlady despite the shared surname, was a second-generation Italian-American with a heart bigger than her profit margin and a soft spot for strays. "You look like you could use a break, kid," she said, examining me with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen her share of desperate people. "Can you handle a midnight to 8 shift?" I lied and said yes, then spent the next week learning to balance plates while dodging grabby hands and crude comments from customers who mistook my youth for availability. The work was exhausting, the pay barely covered my rent and food, and by the end of each shift, my feet felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. But it was honest work, and it put food in my belly and a roof over my head. More importantly, it gave me something to do with my hands and my mind, besides worry about the future. The other waitresses were a mixture of single mothers, aspiring actresses waiting for their big break, and women who'd simply run out of better options. They took me under their collective wing with the easy camaraderie of people who understood struggle without needing explanations. Stick with us, honey, said Dolores, a bleached blonde with kind eyes and a laugh like a honking goose. We'll teach you everything you need to know about surviving in this city on tips and determination. As the weeks passed, my pregnancy became impossible to hide. I let the other girls assume the father was some boy back home who'd abandoned me when things got complicated. It was close enough to the truth that the lie came easily, and they responded with the fierce protectiveness of women who'd all been betrayed by men at one point or another. Men are all bastards when it comes to taking responsibility, declared Carmen, a Puerto Rican girl whose husband had left her with 3 kids and a mountain of debt. They take what they want and leave you to deal with the consequences. I nodded and agreed, and let them believe that my story was just another variation on the oldest theme in the world. Good girl meets bad boy ruins good girl's life, good girl picks up the pieces and moves forward. It was simpler than the truth and much less likely to invite uncomfortable questions. At night alone in my tiny room, I would place my hands on my growing belly and try to feel some connection to the life inside me. But the baby felt like an alien presence, a constant reminder of trauma rather than a symbol of hope. I ate because I had to took vitamins, because the free clinic nurse insisted attended my appointments because I knew I should. But love that seemed as foreign as the city itself. The nightmares started in my 2nd trimester. I'd dream of Mark's hands on me, of his voice, whispering threats in my ear, of his eyes, following me through the crowded streets of Chicago. I'd wake gasping and sweating, convinced I could hear his footsteps in the hallway outside my door. During the day, I found myself scanning newspapers for any mention of my disappearance, expecting to see headlines about a missing girl from rural Iowa. But there was nothing. It was as if Elena Morrison had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving no trace of her existence or her flight. The silence was almost worse than discovery would have been. At least if my story had made the news, I'd know what narrative was being constructed around my absence. Instead, I was left to imagine the worst, that Mark had convinced everyone I'd run away with some imaginary boyfriend, that father was telling people I'd always been troubled and unstable, that mother was keeping my secrets even as she suffered for my absence. I stopped calling myself Elena Morrison and started using my middle name instead. Rose Patterson. I told people a runaway from a farm in Nebraska whose parents had kicked her out when they discovered her pregnancy. The lie felt more real than the truth most days, a simpler story for a complicated life. My body changed in ways that felt both miraculous and terrifying. My breasts grew heavy and tender, my belly rounded with unmistakable pregnancy, my skin took on the glow that people always talked about, but that looked alien in the cracked mirror of my boarding house room. I was becoming a mother, whether I felt ready or not, creating life from trauma in a way that seemed both beautiful and cruel. The baby kicked for the first time during my lunch break at the diner, a flutter that felt like butterfly wings against the inside of my ribcage. I was sitting in the storage room eating a sandwich made from day-old bread and questionable lunch meat when it happened. I pressed my hand to my belly and felt it again, stronger this time, unmistakably purposeful. "Hello?" I whispered, and for the first time since arriving in Chicago, I felt something that might have been hope. Spring came to the city in fits and starts, winter reluctant to release its grip on the concrete and steel. I was 7 months pregnant and barely fitting into the largest uniform Rose could find when the letter arrived. Mrs. Kowalski, my Mrs. Kowalski, not Rose, handed it to me with a suspicious frown, as if mail was an unwelcome intrusion into the carefully ordered chaos of her boarding house. The envelope was cream-colored and expensive-looking, addressed to Elena Morrison in care of the rooming house. My heart stopped when I saw the return address, Hartwell and Associates Attorneys at Law, Cedar Falls, Iowa. I climbed the stairs to my room with legs that felt like water, the letter clutched in my hand like evidence of a crime. Inside, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the envelope for a long time before finding the courage to open it. The letter was brief and formal, written in the careful language that lawyers use to deliver devastating news with professional detachment. Dear Miss Morrison, it is our duty to inform you of the death of your father, James Morrison, which occurred on April 3rd of this year. As specified in his will, a copy of which is enclosed, you are named as a beneficiary of his estate. Additionally, Mr. Morrison left specific instructions that certain personal effects be delivered to you, including a journal he kept during his final months. We have been attempting to locate you for some time and would appreciate your contact at your earliest convenience to discuss the settlement of the estate. Please be advised that there are also matters regarding your brother, Mark Morrison, that require your attention and possible testimony. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Sincerely, Robert Hartwell-esque. I read the letter 3 times before the words made any sense. Father was dead. Dead for almost a month while I'd been serving coffee and taking orders, completely unaware that the man whose violence had shaped my childhood was no longer walking the earth. The will was a simple document that left the farm and most possessions to Mother, with small bequests to Mark and me. But attached to it was a handwritten note in Father's familiar scrawl, shaky and uncertain, in a way that suggested illness or medication. Elena, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're still alive, which is more than I hoped for when you disappeared that night. I found him, girl. Found what you left behind and did what needed doing. The truth dies with me, and maybe that's for the best. Take care of yourself and that baby. You deserve better than what this family gave you. J.M. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Father had found Mark, had discovered something I'd left behind. But what did that mean? What truth was he talking about? But the letter from the lawyer mentioned matters regarding Mark that required my attention. If Father was dead, where was Mark? Why did they need my testimony about him? I was still staring at the letter when my water broke warm fluid soaking through my uniform and onto the thin mattress of my bed. The baby was coming 3 weeks early, apparently triggered by the shock of learning that my father was dead and my past might not be as buried as I'd thought. The labor was long and brutal, made worse by the fact that I was essentially alone in a charity hospital where the nurses treated unwed mothers with barely concealed contempt. I screamed through contractions that felt like my body was being torn in half, and no one held my hand or told me everything would be okay. But when my daughter finally emerged into the world small and perfect and screaming with the indignation of the newly born, something fundamental shifted inside me. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her conception or the circumstances that had created her. She was mine wholly and completely mine, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to love someone more than myself. "What's her name?" asked the exhausted-looking doctor as he placed her in my arms. I looked down at her tiny face, red and wrinkled and more precious than anything I'd ever seen, and the answer came without thought. "Lily," I said. "Her name is Lily." She was my flower pushing up through concrete, my proof that beauty could emerge from the darkest soil. She was hope made flesh, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure she never experienced the kind of fear that had shaped my own childhood. The lawyer's letter could wait. The mysteries surrounding my father's death and whatever had happened to Mark could wait. Everything could wait except this moment, this perfect moment, when I held my daughter for the first time and promised her that we would both be free. But freedom, I was about to learn, was something you had to fight for every single day. And the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you ran or how well you hid. The years that followed Lily's birth blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, determination, and love so fierce, it sometimes took my breath away. We moved from the boarding house to a small apartment in a neighborhood where the cockroaches were smaller, and the heat worked most of the time. I kept waiting tables at Rose's during the day and took in sewing at night, my fingers working by lamplight while Lily slept in a crib I'd bought secondhand and painted white because it was the cheapest paint available. Rose's became our second home. Rose herself, childless and widowed young, appointed herself Lily's honorary grandmother with all the fierce protectiveness that title implied. During my shifts, Lily would sleep in a makeshift nursery Rose had set up in the storage room, or later, when she was older, sit at the counter with coloring books and the endless patience of a child who'd learned early that life required flexibility. That girl's got your artistic eye," Rose would say, watching 3-year-old Lily create elaborate crayon masterpieces of stick figure families where everyone was smiling. "She's going to be something special." I hoped Rose was right. I hoped Lily would have all the choices I'd never had, all the opportunities that had been stolen from me by circumstances beyond my control. I saved every penny I could, building a fund for her future education, $1 at a time. But the past had a way of intruding on even the most carefully constructed new life. On a gray February morning, when Lily was 4 years old, I was wiping down tables at the diner when 2 men in cheap suits walked through the door. They had the unmistakable look of law enforcement, that combination of authority and weariness that came from seeing too much of humanity's darker impulses. "Want Rose Patterson?" the taller one asked, flashing a badge. "I'm Detective Walsh, Chicago PD. This is Detective Kowalski. We need to ask you some questions." My blood turned to ice, but I kept my voice steady. "I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Rose Patterson, but I work here. Rose Kowalski owns the place." "Miss Morrison," Detective Walsh said gently, using a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. "We know who you are. We've been looking for you for quite some time." They sat in a corner booth, and I poured them coffee with hands that only trembled slightly. Lily was at the counter, absorbed in a picture book, unaware that our carefully constructed world was about to collapse around us. "We're investigating the death of Mark Morrison," Detective Kowalski said. "Your brother." "Mark is dead." I managed to sound appropriately shocked, though my heart was hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it. "His remains were discovered 6 months ago during the demolition of your family's farm," Walsh explained. "He was buried in the old root cellar behind the house. We believe he died approximately 5 years ago." 5 years. Mark had been dead for 5 years, buried in our family's backyard, while I'd been building a new life in Chicago. But how had he died, and who had buried him? How did he die? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Blunt force trauma to the head," Kowalski said, watching my face carefully. "We're treating it as a homicide." The word hung in the air between us like a blade. Homicide. Murder. Had I killed him that night? Had the fall in my bedroom been more serious than I'd realized? "We found some interesting things when we processed the scene," Walsh continued, "including this." He pulled out an evidence bag containing my old journal, the one I'd left behind in my hasty escape. My handwriting stared back at me from pages I'd filled with desperate observations and dreams of freedom. "There are some troubling entries in here," Kowalski said. "References to your brother's inappropriate behavior, expressions of fear and anger." I felt the walls closing in around me, the same suffocating sensation I'd experienced in my childhood home. They thought I'd murdered Mark in cold blood, planned it out like some sort of revenge killing, instead of the act of desperate self-defense it had actually been. "I want to call a lawyer," I said. "That's your right," Walsh agreed. "But Miss Morrison, we're not here to arrest you. We're here because we think you might be a victim too." The words caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Your father left behind some materials before he died. A journal, letters, other documentation. The picture they paint of your family, it's complicated." Kowalski leaned forward, his expression softening. "We know what your brother was doing to you. We know why you ran away. And we have reason to believe that you weren't the one who killed him." The diner seemed to spin around me, reality shifting like sand beneath my feet. "What are you talking about?" James Morrison confessed to killing his son," Walsh said quietly. "It's all documented in his journal. He found Mark's body in your room after you'd left, figured out what had happened, and made a choice about what kind of justice his son deserved." I couldn't breathe. Father had killed Mark, but Mark was already dead when I left him. I'd seen his lifeless eyes, felt the stillness of his body. Hadn't I? "There's more," Kowalski said. "Medical examination of the remains shows that Mark survived the initial head trauma. He was unconscious but alive when your father found him. Your father, he made a decision about whether his son deserved to recover." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Mark hadn't died from his fall in my bedroom. He'd been alive, possibly recoverable, when Father discovered him. And Father had chosen to let him die, or worse, had actively killed him rather than allow his abuse to continue. "Well, we're not pressing charges," Walsh said. "Self-defense is self-defense even if it didn't result in immediate death. And your father's actions, while technically criminal, were those of a man trying to protect his daughter in the only way he knew how." They left their cards and asked me to call if I remembered anything else that might be helpful to their investigation. After they were gone, I sat in the empty diner with Lily, curled up in my lap, trying to process the truth that had just been revealed. My father, violent, angry James Morrison, had saved me in the end. He'd discovered his son's crimes, his daughter's desperate flight, and his own failure as a protector, and he'd made the hardest choice a parent could make. He'd chosen justice over family loyalty and had carried the weight of that decision until his death. Mama Lily looked up at me with concerned 4-year-old eyes. "You're crying." "Happy tears, baby girl," I whispered, holding her closer. "Mama just learned something important about her daddy." "Your daddy?" "Yes, he tried to protect me even when I didn't know it. That night, I called the lawyer in Cedar Falls and made arrangements to receive my father's journal. When it arrived a week later, I read it from cover to cover, my hands shaking as I absorbed the truth about that night 5 years ago. Father's handwriting was shaky from the heart disease that would eventually kill him, but his words were clear and unflinching. "Found the boy unconscious in Elena's room, blood all over the floor. She was gone, probably thought she'd killed him. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but he was still breathing when I got there. Still breathing and still. The animal who'd been hurting my little girl for God knows how long. I could have called for help. Could have gotten him to a hospital, let the doctors save him, let the law sort out what happened. But I knew what would happen then. He'd wake up and lie about everything. Make it seem like Elena was the crazy one, the one who couldn't be trusted. My girl would spend the rest of her life running from what he'd done to her, so I made a choice. I put a pillow over his face and held it there until he stopped breathing. Then I buried him deep in the root cellar where no one would ever find him, and I told everyone he'd left for California to find work. Elena deserved better than what this family gave her. She deserved a chance to start over, to build something good from the ruins we'd made of her childhood. If killing my son gave her that chance, then I'll answer to God for it when my time comes. But I won't apologize for protecting my daughter when I should have been protecting her all along. I closed the journal and held it against my chest, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in years, I grieved for my father, not the man who'd beaten me and terrorized my mother, but the broken human being who'd tried to make amends in the only way he knew how. There was more in the package from the lawyer. A letter addressed to me, written just before Father's death. "Elena, if you're reading this, then you survived. You got away from us and built something better, and that's all I ever wanted for you. I know I was a poor excuse for a father, and I know the damage I did can't be undone with words or actions or even death. But I want you to know that you were the best thing that ever came out of this family, and whatever you've become, wherever you are, I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you even when I was too drunk or too angry or too scared to show it. Take care of that baby. Give her everything we couldn't give you." And don't let our failures stop you from believing in love and goodness, in the possibility that families can be different from the one you were born into. You're free now, really free. Use that freedom to build something beautiful. Love your father. And there was one final surprise tucked into the envelope, a small sketch I'd drawn when I was 8 years old, carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. It showed a little girl standing in a field of sunflowers, her face turned toward the sun, her arms outstretched, as if she was trying to embrace the whole world. I'd completely forgotten drawing it, but Father had kept it all these years, a reminder of the daughter I'd been before fear and silence had nearly destroyed me. I read Father's letter to Lily on her 18th birthday, sitting in the art studio she'd set up in the spare bedroom of our apartment, the apartment I'd been able to buy with money from my book sales and speaking engagements. She'd inherited my talent for drawing, but unlike me, she'd never had to hide it or apologize for it. Her walls were covered with paintings and sketches that spoke of hope and possibility, not escape and desperation. "He sounds complicated," she said after I finished reading. I agreed. People usually are. The same person can be both a source of pain and a source of protection, sometimes within the same day. Do you forgive him? It was a question I'd been asking myself for years, and I still wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "I understand him," I said finally. And maybe understanding is more important than forgiveness. Lily had grown up knowing she was different from other kids, that her father wasn't in the picture, that her mother had secrets that sometimes made her wake up crying in the night. But she'd also grown up surrounded by love, by people who saw her potential and encouraged her dreams without reservation. Rose, from the diner, had become her chosen grandmother, celebrating every birthday and school achievement like they were family milestones. Carmen and Dolores and the other waitresses had formed a network of aunties who offered advice about everything from homework to heartbreak. We'd built our own family from scratch, choosing love over biology and commitment over convenience. "I want to know about him," Lily said eventually. "About Mark, about what really happened that night." So I told her. All of it. The abuse, the pregnancy, the night I thought I'd killed her father, the truth about what Father had actually done. I watched her face change as the story unfolded, saw her process the reality of her origins with the same strength and grace she'd shown throughout her childhood. "I'm sorry," she said when I finished. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Don't be sorry for existing," I said fiercely. "You're the best thing that ever came out of that darkness. You're proof that love can grow in even the most impossible places." "But it must be hard," she said, looking at me and remembering, "When I look at you, I don't see him." I interrupted. "I see you. I see your kindness, your talent, your determination to make the world better than it was when you found it. I see the woman you've chosen to become, not the circumstances you came from." She hugged me. Then this young woman who'd grown up to be everything I'd dreamed she could be, confident, talented, unafraid to take up space in the world. She was planning to attend art school in New York, had already been accepted to 3 different programs with scholarship offers that would cover most of her expenses. "Will you be okay?" she asked. "When I leave for school?" I looked around our apartment at the walls covered with both our artwork at the life we'd built together, from nothing but determination and hope. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to be truly alone, but the prospect didn't terrify me the way it once would have. "I'll be more than okay," I said and meant it. "I have work to do, stories to tell, people to help." My book, Breaking the Silence, A Daughter's Journey from Abuse to Healing, had been published 2 years earlier and had become an unexpected bestseller. The memoir chronicled my childhood trauma, my escape to Chicago, and the long process of building a life from the wreckage of family violence. But more than just telling my story, the book had started conversations about sibling abuse, family silence, and the long-term effects of childhood trauma. I'd begun speaking at conferences and shelters, sharing my experience with other survivors, and advocating for better resources for families affected by violence. The thing about secrets, I would tell audiences, is that they only have power over you as long as you keep them. The moment you speak your truth to a friend, a counselor, a police officer, anyone who will listen, the secret begins to lose its grip on your life. A documentary filmmaker had approached me about turning my story into a film, and after months of consideration, I'd agreed. The project, titled Fragments of Light, would examine not just my personal journey, but the broader issues of family violence and survival. "Your story needs to be told," the director had said during our first meeting. "Not just because it's compelling, but because it offers hope to people who think there's no way out of their circumstances." The film premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival 6 months after Lily left for college. Sitting in the darkened theater, watching my life unfold on screen, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the girl I'd been, pride in the woman I'd become, and hope for all the people who might see themselves in my story. The final shot of the documentary was footage of Lily's high school graduation, where she'd given the valedictorian speech about the importance of chosen family and the power of art to transform trauma into beauty. As I watched her cross the stage, confident and radiant in her cap and gown, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or justice, and everything to do with love transformed into purpose. "She's remarkable," the filmmaker said as we watched the footage together in the editing room. "She's everything I dreamed she could be," I replied, "and proof that we can break cycles of violence and create something better for the next generation." The documentary won several awards and sparked important conversations about family violence and survivor support services. But the response that mattered most to me came from a young woman who approached me after a screening in Milwaukee. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper, "for showing me that it's possible to survive." I looked at her, barely 20, with old eyes and a careful way of moving that I recognized from my own past, and saw myself at her age. Lost, afraid, convinced that the darkness would never end. "It is possible," I told her. "It's hard and it takes time, but it's possible, and you don't have to do it alone." I started volunteering at a women's shelter, teaching art classes to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply rewarding, each small breakthrough a reminder of why I'd fought so hard to build a different kind of life. "Art saved me," I would tell my students as they worked on their projects. "Not because it made the pain go away, but because it gave me a way to transform that pain into something meaningful. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And art can be one way of making sure both are heard." 5 years after the documentary's release, I received a call that changed everything again. Lily, now 23 and working as an art therapist with traumatized children, was getting married to a young man named David, who looked at her the way I'd always dreamed someone would, with respect and admiration and the kind of love that sought to build rather than possess. "I want you to help plan the wedding," she told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "I want it to be a celebration of everything we've built together, everything we've overcome." We held the ceremony in Lincoln Park, surrounded by the chosen family we'd assembled over the years. Rose walked Lily down the aisle, her eyes bright with proud tears, while Carmen and Dolores fussed over the reception details with the efficiency of women who'd learned to make miracles happen on tight budgets. As I watched my daughter promise to love and honor a man who clearly adored her, I thought about the cycle we'd broken together. Lily would never know the fear that had shaped my childhood, would never have to choose between silence and safety. Her children, if she chose to have them, would grow up in a home where love was expressed through kindness rather than control, where voices were heard rather than silenced. "You did good, kid," Rose whispered to me as we watched the newlyweds dance their first dance as husband and wife. "We all did," I replied, looking around at the faces of the people who'd helped raise Lily, who'd shown her that families could be built from choice and commitment rather than just blood and obligation. 2 years later, Lily called with news that made my heart soar. She was pregnant. As I held my newborn granddaughter for the first time, A perfect little girl with Lily's eyes and my stubborn chin, I whispered the same promise I'd made to her mother 25 years earlier. You're going to be loved. You're going to be safe. You're going to be free. That child would never know the weight of silence or the fear of violence. She would grow up in the light we'd fought so hard to create, surrounded by people who celebrated her voice and encouraged her dreams. And maybe that was the real miracle after all, not just surviving the darkness, but ensuring that the next generation would never have to. Today, at 53, I continue the work of living and healing and helping others find their own paths to freedom. My second book, Letters to My Daughter: Breaking Cycles and Building Hope, became a guide for survivors navigating the complex journey from trauma to recovery. I speak regularly at conferences and universities, sharing my story with audiences who need to hear that survival is possible, that healing is real, and that families can be redefined by love rather than limited by biology. And every morning I wake up in my sunny apartment, the one I bought with royalties from my books, the one with large windows that let in more light than I ever thought possible, and I paint. Not because I have to, not because I'm trying to escape anything, but because creating beauty has become my way of celebrating the miracle of being alive, of growing, of continuing to become. The weight of silence nearly destroyed me once, but the power of truth shared freely and without shame set me free. And freedom, I've learned, isn't a destination, but a daily practice, something you choose again and again, one sunrise at a time. My granddaughter is learning to walk now, taking tentative steps between her parents' outstretched arms, falling, and getting up again with the fearless determination of someone who's never been taught to be afraid of trying. When she sees me, her face lights up with pure joy, and she reaches for me with complete trust. "Gamma," she says, because she can't quite manage grandma yet, and the sound of her voice fills me with a happiness so profound, it sometimes brings tears to my eyes. This is what we fought for, this ordinary miracle of a child who knows she's loved, who trusts that the adults in her life will keep her safe, who's growing up in a world where her voice matters and her dreams are valid. The fragments of light that began with my own desperate need to survive have grown into something larger than I ever imagined possible. Every person who reads my books, every survivor who finds courage in my story, every child who grows up free from the violence that once defined my world, they're all part of the light that emerged from that long ago darkness. I think about the girl I was at 15, sitting in her bedroom and drawing pictures of places she'd never seen, dreaming of escape while carrying secrets too heavy for her young shoulders. She could never have imagined this life, this community, this sense of purpose and belonging. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the girl drawing sunflowers in a house full of secrets was planting seeds, without knowing it, creating something beautiful that would take decades to bloom, but would be worth every moment of waiting. Tonight, I'll go home to my apartment and I'll paint. Not because I'm trying to escape anything, but because creating beauty has become my way of honoring the journey that brought me here. I'll paint until dawn if I need to, losing myself in color and light and the simple joy of bringing something new into the world. And tomorrow, I'll continue the work of living the daily practice of choosing hope over fear, love over silence, connection over isolation. I'll answer emails from readers, work on my next book, maybe visit Lily and her family, and watch my granddaughter discover something new about the world. The story that began with silence and shame has become one of voice and healing. The trauma that once threatened to destroy me has been transformed into a source of strength for others. And the family that was broken by violence has been rebuilt with love chosen freely and maintained through commitment to each other's well-being. This is my life now, not perfect, but purposeful. Not without pain, but filled with meaning. not defined by what was done to me, but by what I chose to do with what was done to me. And every day, I wake up grateful for the journey that brought me here, for the people who helped me along the way, and for the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil.